But new drama, Dancing on the Edge, continues tonight at 9. Now on BBC2, Joe Coburn has the Daily Politics.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Monday is often a pretty quiet day here at Westminster, with MPs making their way back to work from their constituencies all over the UK. But today is not one of those days. We're expecting a big announcement on how the government plans to fund the long-term care of the elderly, which was a huge row at the last general election. All the signs are that ministers will cap the amount any one individual will have to pay. And the row about horse meat getting into burgers and other types of food is still reverberating around Westminster. It's not yet a food safety issue, but we're being told to brace ourselves for bad news to come. The UK government has put out a report saying that an independent Scotland would have to reapply to Europe, NATO, and have to renegotiate a whole fist of international treaties, to the fury of the SNP. And the starting gun has well and truly been fired in the Eastleigh by-election, with the big parties at each other's throats in the fight to replace Chris Hume. All that in the next hour, and our special guest of the day is Axelle Lemaire, who last year became the first ever member of the French Parliament for the new constituency of Northern Europe, which includes the whole of the United Kingdom. Rather large constituency. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Let's start with horse meat, so to speak. Although many of us would probably rather not, the Environment Secretary Owen Paterson is expected to tell MPs in the House this afternoon that there is likely to be more unwelcome news about the wrong kind of meat getting into British supermarkets. Romania is investigating claims that one of its abattoirs is responsible, and Mr Paterson says he thinks a criminal conspiracy could be involved.
Reports today we've had from France looks as if it might have been pinned down to 2 abattoirs in Romania. But I'll be talking to authorities later in the day to establish that. But I very much hope that these legal processes do flush out the criminals, because it is completely unacceptable that British consumers should be sold a product marked as one thing which actually contains something else.
Owen Paterson there. Well, with us now is Anne McIntosh, who chairs the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. Anne McIntosh, welcome to the programme. Do you trust the Food Standards Authority and your own government's advice to carry on eating beef products?
Well, personally, I would like to see the whole trade suspended until we know where the meat, the processed and frozen foods, is coming from, and that it is accurately labelled.
So you don't trust at the moment, you don't trust that advice?
Trust is a very big word. The evidence we heard in committee was that the Irish FSA started testing in November, and that our own FSA were informed of that, and we can't quite understand why the UK FSA did not start testing in November. But if it now appears, there was a news report over the weekend that the Minister for Agriculture in Romania believes that the product checks that we were told and we know have to take place before any meat consignment leaves a member state to go to another has to be checked for its product content physically, and that the label matches the content. He now believes that this has not happened. Now, I think we should allow those investigations to take place. If it's proven the product checks did not take place, then I think the Commission should shut down that circulation of suspect meat into the EU for a temporary period.
For the public now, at this point, until we know the results of those tests, until you've established the facts of meat produced or made in Romania, are you saying that it's not safe to eat those beef products that the government is saying you can?
I simply don't know, but what I would say is that there is no question mark over British farm products. We now produce to the highest animal welfare standard. We've got absolute 100% traceability. If you buy fresh meat with the red tractor sign and go back to having a roast at the weekend, eating it during the week, I believe that British meat should be going into these frozen and processed foods for the moment.
Axelle Lemaire, do you think And would you want to see a suspension of beef products at this point until tests have established exactly what's in them?
So to answer your question very accurately, at this very precise moment, no, I think it would be too dramatic, including for the food industry. And if I'm correct, some horse meat was found in some industries in Northern Ireland back in September last year. So I think all the different EU member states are concerned. The French agriculture minister spoke of an international criminal organization. What it shows is how complex the network of suppliers have become. In this particular case, it could be up to 7 or 8 different big players based in Cyprus, Holland, France, Luxembourg being involved, and so we have to ensure that the controls are effective.
But the controls are not effective, and the EU Commission already previously banned live horse exports from Romania. I'm not I don't want to pick on Romania, but it appears to be, and this needs to be confirmed, that the contaminated source is from Romania. If that is the case, then I think it's wrong to ask the food industry in this country, France, Ireland, everywhere else, to go through the huge costs of these tests when we could be sourcing fresh meat from France and other countries which is not contaminated. But if it proves that the source of contamination is Romania, if the Minister of Agriculture in Romania agrees that they've not conducted the product checks at port of exit, they are breaking EU regulations on labelling.
Would you say the government's actually on top of this crisis?
I think that the government has done as much as they could in the circumstances. I think it is.
But they haven't done what you're advising, which is to actually ban the sale of these items until we have the results of the test.
The Secretary of State has agreed to ban when we've proved that there is a public health risk. It's kind of cart and horse, to use a horse metaphor.
That was very brave of you, Anne McIntosh.
But I think I don't want Britain to act unilaterally, even though the Commission has unilaterally shut down production in my own constituency of desinewed meat, and yet we're still importing it from other EU countries.
I mean, there are reports, Axelle Lemaire, that 6 French supermarket chains have withdrawn meals from Findus, so they've taken action themselves.
Yes.
If the tests come back, and it's not the horse meat itself, but if there is a trace of a drug that shouldn't be in the food chain that is given to horses, then, of course, there might be a food safety risk.
Clearly, then it's a health issue. But at this precise moment, we have no idea. Apparently, the level of that chemical product that varies a lot depending on where the horse meat was found, in which country, where it comes from. So, where it's impossible to tell now. So, should we, make a whole ban on all meat?
Well, I think
throughout Europe,
if it's a labelling crime, and if the Romanians accept that they've broken the labelling regulations,
there's no food safety issue.
Well, potentially there is. We're not disagreeing on that. But at the moment, we're all saying it's a labelling issue. They're selling meat, which is horse, and passing it off as beef.
So it's a trade description problem.
To me, there are EU regulations that covers this that would lead to a temporary suspension until we can prove the source of contamination, and then we can. There's no question of fresh meat, but they would still have to be tested. My basic point is that Romania appears to be in breach of EU regulations. It's a very technical point where they should have checked the content of the meat before it left Romania to go into free circulation across the European Union. This is a massive scale.
I agree, but my point is it may have happened in Romania, it could happen in another country tomorrow, and the controls in this country, in Britain, for example, have decreased by 1/3 in the last 3 years, just because this is linked to cuts in the jobs being carried by public authorities.
No.
This is, to me, a direct consequence
I would dispute that.
Public policies.
In this country, we do tests. This is something that could be reviewed. We could separate issues to look at the whole of the FSA. But in this country, we do tests on a risk basis. And until now, there has never been a risk of this nature.
Anne McIntosh, thank you.
Thank you.
Scotland would face massive legal uncertainties in the event of a vote for independence, according to a report published today by the UK government. The report cites the evidence of a number of legal experts, including Sir David Edward from the Edinburgh Law School, and it suggests that Scotland would have to renegotiate 14,000 international treaties, including membership of NATO, the International Monetary Fund and the European Union itself. The report is pretty specific, saying there is no prospect that an independent Scottish state would automatically become a new member of the EU upon independence because there is no explicit provision for this process in the EU's own membership rules. Neither would an independent Scotland automatically inherit the UK's opt-outs. This was Lord Wallace, the Advocate General for Scotland, a little earlier today.
It would not automatically inherit the terms of membership currently enjoyed by the UK. It would not inherit any of the UK's opt-outs in relation to the euro and the Schengen provisions on border control, nor would it automatically inherit the UK's budget rebate worth some £3 billion to the British taxpayer in 2011. As Sir David himself has said, all that is certain is uncertainty.
Well, with us now is Michael Moore, the Secretary of State for Scotland, and the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Michael Moore, first of all, it's quite an unusual move to publish legal advice. Why have you done it?
This is very basic to the big debate we're now having in Scotland about what is best for our future. And our report today, as well as setting out the legal opinion, starts with a very positive case that Scotland gets the best of both worlds by being part of the United Kingdom. We get to decide things here in Edinburgh in our Parliament that affect day-to-day things like education and health, but we've got the opportunity and strength that comes through the UK economy and the security we get from being part of a huge state like the United Kingdom. What we then go on to argue is that should Scotland decide, if we decide to go our own way, then what implications flow from that. And it's clear to us, with leading experts now backing up our position, that Scotland would be a new state. It would have to negotiate its place in the world, whereas the rest of the UK would continue and still be part of major institutions like the European Union, like the United Nations Security Council, the IMF, and so much more.
And we've got that,
and
we've
I'm
stated
very
that,
keen
Michael.
That as we get this debate...
I just want...
Indeed, but the key thing is that we have a basic starting point for the many arguments we're going to have over the next 18 months, and I think this is a very useful way of putting that forward.
Now, the SNP have accused you of a near-colonial approach. This idea, Nicola Sturgeon said, for the UK government to argue that the UK is a continuing state and that an independent Scotland would have no rights betrays the near-colonial attitude to Scotland's position as a nation. What do you say to that?
I was very disappointed by the tone of those remarks and the way in which they were put forward. And frankly, that's not what has characterised the debate so far. I think we're just setting out a simple legal reality, that here is our view of the situation were Scotland to become independent. Of course, we in Scotland would negotiate to continue as part of the European Union. However, we wouldn't have the UK's opt-outs automatically there, as Jim Wallace's clip just showed to your viewers. And aside from that, we wouldn't have our place at the top table in the United Nations, the IMF, and so many other places. I think that's just a legitimate part of the debate. It's important we have it fully discussed in Scotland.
Or is it an attempt to frighten people into accepting the status quo? Because for all the legal advice that you have set out today, there will no doubt be lawyers who would argue the opposite.
Any good legal argument will have lots of different sides to it.
Right.
But I think the way we've set out the argument today establishes very clearly that the leading experts in this field agree the basis on which Scotland would become a new state and the rest of the UK would continue as the existing UK state. That has profound implications for us. Now, to duck away from that would be, I think, unfair on people in Scotland and would be a disservice to the debate. We will listen to others put their views forward, but I think we have a very clear starting point. We have a legal framework which is clear, and from that we understand the politics and the negotiations that would arise if Scotland decided we were going to be independent.
All right, Michael Moore, just bear with us for a moment. Nicola Sturgeon, profound implications of that statement, which is extremely clear and explicit. There is no prospect that an independent Scottish state would automatically become a new member of the EU upon independence.
Well, it's a predictably arrogant position for the UK government to take, this notion that if Scotland makes a democratic decision to be independent, then the rest of the UK waltzes off with all the rights and Scotland is left with nothing.
But
It
this is
kind of
illegal.
shatters.
These are the legal voices, aren't they, Nicholas?
I'm
This is
simply
not
saying it
political.
shatters-
This
it
is not a
shatters the
political voice. Well, let's
suggestion.
just establish that this is legal
Well,
advice.
this is a legal opinion. It is an opinion. It's produced, yes, by eminent experts, but I can quote you other eminent experts who take the opposite view. Professor David Sheffer, for example, who argues that Scotland would be a co-equal successor state with the rest of the UK. The point is, the international law in this area is not clear, and these are matters that will be settled by negotiation and agreement. And I listened this morning on BBC Radio to one of the authors of this legal opinion, James Crawford, accept that very point. He said that the timetable the Scottish Government had set out for negotiations was realistic. He said that the issue of EU membership, although it would require negotiations, something the Scottish Government agrees with, would not be difficult, that the whole treaty issue would not cause any problems. So I'm not sure if that's what the UK Government intended to come across today, but certainly James Crawford seems to have backed up the core contention of the Scottish Government. It would be a matter of negotiation.
Sure. Can I just go back, though, to the early stages when this was being talked about? Alex Salmond spoke about a seamless transfer in terms of Scotland's relationship with the EU. Now, you may be right. Negotiations could take place and you may be able to renegotiate exactly what you want, but it is not a seamless transfer, is it? It is uncertain.
Well, firstly, the real doubt about membership of the European Union comes from David Cameron's in-out referendum.
Right.
We've argued a case that if Scotland votes yes in 2014, then there will be a process of negotiation, firstly with the UK government before we become independent in 2016. In parallel to that, of course, we will require to negotiate the terms of our
So it's not a
continuing
seamless
membership
transfer,
with the
though, is it?
European
It's not
Union.
a guarantee.
Well, we will be arguing on things like the euro, Schengen, the rebate. We'll be arguing for a continuation of the status quo of our relationship with Europe. And we have to come back to the central political common sense argument here. Surely nobody is arguing that it's not in the interests of Scotland to remain within the European Union, but also that it's not in the overwhelming interests of Europe to keep Scotland as a member. And we've seen experts say precisely that it would make no sense to put Scotland outside of the European Union simply for us to negotiate our way back in. The process of negotiation will be from within the European Union.
Let's put that, Nicholas Sturgeon, just stay there, to Axelle Lemaire. Is it in the European Union's interest to have Scotland as a new state arguing from within the European Union?
I think you're right to put the question like this, because in the end it's going to be a political decision. There is what public international law says, and opinions are not always consistent on that issue. You can also look at what the Canadian Supreme Court said about the impact of Quebec independence on the renegotiations of the treaties. But then there's also the political reality, and in the end what other EU member states would look at is what would the real impact of Scotland becoming independent would be.
What would France be looking at then? What would France's view be in terms of looking at Scotland in the future if it became an independent state?
Well, I suppose trade and commercial interactions between the two countries, and how long would it take to renegotiate, for example, cooperation in judicial matters? Would it affect the people? Would it affect the proceedings of criminals? So all this would probably have to be dealt with in very practical terms.
And would it take time?
I suppose this depends on what the member states want to do.
Michael Moore, can I just come back to you briefly? I mean, in terms of the assets of the UK, are you also prepared to take on all of its liabilities, such as the UK national debt, if we're going to follow the line in terms of whether Scotland becomes independent and has to reapply for EU membership?
Well, what we've said are that key UK institutions, which are governed by the UK Parliament and its laws, would remain part of the rest of the UK. And of course, Nicola and others may argue they want to continue to have a relationship with the Bank of England, to continue to use the currency, although I would point out that we already have the pound in Scotland. Why we need to become independent to get it again is beyond me. But on the key issue of the sharing out of the liabilities, the national debt, pension liabilities and so on, of course there would have to be an equitable, fair distribution of that. We acknowledge that in our report today. But just on one point that Nicola was saying about the attitude that we are adopting here, I think it's highly curious that you would have a Scottish Government SNP position that suggests that as a result of votes taken here in Scotland, the rest of the UK might be be thrown out of the UN Security Council, the EU, the IMF and all these other international organisations. I think people elsewhere in the UK will have paused to reflect on that. The key thing here is that we have a straightforward legal starting point set out from us today, and much of this is negotiations and politics after the vote. I'm glad we've now got the Scottish Government acknowledging that, but that just reinforces my basic view. We are better off as part of the UK. We get the best of both worlds.
Right, Nicola Sturgeon, just finally, a law firm in Scotland has put out a report today saying that more businesses are asking for their own legal advice before there is a decision, obviously, on the referendum. Do you agree that even businesses in Scotland now are uncertain about which way it's going to go and are unsure what to do in terms of planning for the long term?
Well, there's a vigorous debate underway in Scotland. The Scottish Government, through our Independent Fiscal Commission, has made a substantial contribution to that debate today in the report about the macroeconomic framework in Scotland. The businesses I speak to want that kind of information, and the Scottish Government will be working hard to make sure that they get it, so that people in Scotland can make a positive, informed choice, not simply have to listen to some of the attempts at scaremongering that we all too often hear from the UK Government and those advocating a no vote.
Nicola Sturgeon, Michael Moore, thank you both very much. The relationship between France and Britain has always been complicated, to say the least. Sometimes closest allies, sometimes sworn enemies, and although not quite as bloodthirsty as in certain periods of history, our recent political past has certainly had its ups and downs. These days, however, some experts detect a thawing between Paris and London, a coming together of our national interests. But can we keep the entente cordiale? Here's David Thompson.
Welcome to France's sixth biggest city. You might know it as London, but more than 300,000 French people live here, and they call it home, which is more than Bordeaux, Nantes or Strasbourg can say. But it's not just here. Newcastle United could field almost an entire team made up of French players, and in return, David Beckham's gone to Paris Saint-Germain, so it's all good. In fact, could this be the beginning of a rather beautiful friendship?
Relations are good. There's a lot of cooperation on Mali, for example, and that's greatly appreciated by the French government, and particularly by President Hollande. The two countries actually, beyond the cliches, cooperate a great deal on very many international issues, like Iran, for example. They cooperated on Libya. They're talking a lot about Iran. So there are very many things that the general public aren't necessarily aware of, and maybe why should they be?
But Dave and Francois weren't always so matey. Our Prime Minister refused to meet Monsieur Hollande during last year's French presidential election campaign and praised his rival Nicolas Sarkozy. Whoops.
Here was this new socialist president who felt, yes, snubbed, but things have decidedly gone from frosty and chilly to much warmer. President Hollande speaks English, they're able to communicate directly. There are many things that the two countries are cooperating on.
Not only that, but whisper it quietly, we might be becoming a bit more like the French, and they might be becoming a bit more like us.
Both countries have got rid of their empires, they've changed, they've become more normal-sized, middle-of-the-road European countries, and they've both become more global. The British are more willing to embrace globalisation than the French, but the French, if reluctantly, have also become global. They export and invest all over the world, as do the British, and I think in the new global environment they both realise, at least some of the time, that they're rather small and that they need to work with each other and with the EU if they want to shape the global environment in which they operate.
There is, however, what might politely be described as an elephant in the room. Begins with an E, ends with a U, and it could bring our new political friendship with the French to a rather sticky end.
If the British seem to be on the brink of leaving the EU or threatening to leave the EU, they cannot expect to have close relations with Paris because the EU is fundamental to France's existence as a European power. If Britain decides to stay in the EU and renegotiates and votes to stay in, then we can look forward to a fairly friendly and happy relationship between London and Paris. It really depends on Britain's own relationship with the EU.
The Brits and the French have blown hot and cold for centuries, allies one minute, rivals the next. The Channel may separate us, but these days, London and Paris may be closer than you think.
David Thompson reporting there. We're here to test the state of Anglo-French relations. Axelle Lemaire, of course, is here, and Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin. Welcome to the programme. Before we get down to the nitty-gritty, Bernard Jenkin, when David Cameron stands up in the Commons this afternoon, hails a victory for achieving a cut in the EU's overall budget for the first time, will you be cheering?
Yes, certainly something has been achieved, and that is the first ever reduction in the European Community budget over the 7-year perspective. But I think we need to be cautious. This isn't the new settlement. This isn't the new relationship. We're still waiting to see from David Cameron what the new relationship will look like that he intends to renegotiate before the referendum in the next Parliament.
And, of course, Britain could still end up paying more than it has done in the past. Even though the overall budget comes down, our portion could go up.
Oh, yes. In fact, not just might go up, will certainly go up by billions. And I think what is going to be interesting is how this plays out politically. Are these relatively modest and symbolic victories going to be enough to mollify sentiment in the country, or are people going to focus on the substance? Because actually we'd like to see our net contribution going down. At the moment our net contribution's going to be more than our overseas aid budget, which is already going up. So I think that's a big issue.
One of the things that was clear, though, from the budget negotiations, Axelle Lemaire, was that Germany was the key player here. Angela Merkel decided to side with David Cameron, and France was sidelined.
Yes, again, very political. There are two Conservatives, and Angela Merkel is entering an important political period for her, and she has to be with other Conservative leaders who can support her in her campaign. So clearly, from the outside, the impression is that both Britain and Germany are exporting their austerity. So again, this is a political decision, but the impact on the people living in Europe will be huge, because they do benefit from the money being spent in Brussels.
What does that do to relations then, Anglo-French relations, if clearly, as you've just set out, it's Angela Merkel and David Cameron versus François Hollande?
Well, this is why the results of the German elections will be very important, and of the British elections as well. But I don't think it has, in the short term, a huge impact. But I do agree with Mr. Grant when he says that Europe could be at the heart of the difficult bilateral relationship. I can see it from Paris in Parliament, and that is new. My colleagues are now very annoyed and get upset easily whenever we mention the British, because it's, they keep asking for more and more and more. They want to play by their rules, where in Europe it should be, decided together.
Well, you're threatening Anglo-French relations here, particularly with an in-out referendum, the potential of Britain leaving the EU.
Well, we had very strong relations with the French before we joined the common market, and even if we were to leave, not something I personally advocate, we would continue to have very strong relations.
Well, not according to Axelle Lemaire.
Well, let's just think about it practically. I mean, France and the United Kingdom are the two countries in Europe that understand that hard power and soft power are two sides of the same coin. Other countries have this wishful idea that somehow soft power can trump American hard power. But France is one of the few countries that really understands, unless you're backing up your soft power, ultimately with military deterrence, you're not a very powerful country. And I think that puts France and Britain very much on the same page on the whole issue of European foreign relations with the rest of the world.
All right, foreign relations. Let's have a look at the list of powers that could be repatriated. Some of the suggestions that have been made by a group of Conservative MPs, Axelle Lemaire: Working Time Directive. The UK should have an opt-out from all policing and criminal justice measures, and an emergency break on any new laws that affect financial services. Would France sign up to that?
Clearly not. I think judicial cooperation includes the European arrest warrant. Thanks to that warrant, I think it's up to 13,000 criminals who are arrested every year in one country and sent to another. When you had the bombings in 2005 in London, it took only a few days to get one of the author of the attack sent back to London, whereas it would have taken 10 years before that warrant was put into place. So that is what Europe is about.
I don't agree with that. I mean, we have extradition treaties with lots of different countries. We don't need to be in the European Union. Well, I mean, if you want to be obstructive about it, that's another matter. But we have very quick...
No, that's a reality. It's not about being obstructive. It's a reality. That's how it works.
The extradition internationally works most part by cooperation and not by central judicial authorities. And the feeling that a lot of British people is that these apparently very obvious good things are put into the treaties. They are actually an end in themselves. They're trying to create a European Union for which there is no democratic consent.
Right. But
and if the French are, in the end, jealous of their national sovereignty, just as we are, and there is an element of self-deception, pretending that you can be a sovereign state and more included into the
But Bernard Jacob, this is about how strong the chances are for a UK government to repatriate those powers. Axelle Lemaire has said on that issue...
Personally, I agree with...
What about on the Working Time Directive?
I agree that
Would France agree for Britain to opt out?
No, I agree with Axelle that this is a forlorn hope that we're going to be able to pick and choose from within the existing treaties. I think we need to develop a different kind of membership. There are those who are going to be in the euro, in the ever closer union, in the political federation that is emerging.
But it's already the case. We've got Schengen, we've got the Eurozone, we've got... It's already the case, and Britain has its full place in the current system.
And the question is, what is the relationship for countries like Norway, Switzerland, other countries in the EU that aren't going to join the euro? What is the relationship that with these countries should have within the European Union, that we're all in the same family of democratic nations? And I think getting all religious about the existing treaties and saying it's all irrevocable, this is not the language
Well, it's not irrevocable, but what Axelle Lemaire is saying is it could be disadvantageous to Britain.
Well, I think we can decide that for ourselves. In fact, most of our trade is now externally outside the European Union. That's the trade that's growing. The trade that with the... Yes, it is.
We don't have the same figures.
Well, I will send you the figures.
60% of the British exports are sent to other EU states.
60% is a completely bogus, wrong number, and I challenge you to verify that. In 2011, which for the latest year figures became available, well under 50% of our manufactured goods were exported to the European Union, and it's growing much faster. Trade with the rest of the world is growing much faster. Now, the point you have to ask yourself, why are we letting the tail wag the dog? Why less than 10% of our GDP is exported directly to the European Union?
Well, let Axelle Lemaire answer that.
Why should we regulate 100% of our economy?
Why can't Britain renegotiate to a position that is better for Britain and still play a leading role in the European Union?
Because it would be about trade only. So no, for example, no controls, no sanitary controls over horse meat any longer. Why would the other EU
they're not working
states
very well at the moment.
have to pay for something that the British don't want to pay for?
But this horse meat scandal absolutely demonstrates...
What I'm trying to say is that it would have huge consequences, not only on trade relations, but on every single thing that has been built up over 50 years between your country and mine.
Well, a few years ago, President Giscard said we might have to give Britain a special status.
You've got one. You've got the biggest rebate in Europe already.
Just a month ago, Jacques Delors actually talked about allowing Britain to have a different arrangement with the European Union.
No, Delors said leave Britain, leave Europe.
It might well be a relationship.
Which is very serious. I'm sorry.
It might be a relationship where we step outside the existing treaties and have a much more bilateral relationship with our European partners than we have at present. I think we've got to look at this with an open mind, because the idea that we're somehow going to one day join the euro and be in the federal Europe, that is not going to happen. So the question that we've got to answer is, how do we skin this particular cat so that we can be amicable and friendly, cooperating neighbours together?
Axelle, what's your prospect then for Anglo-French relations then in the future?
At a bilateral level, I think we're just like an old couple. Look at us arguing, and this will remain. But I think again, it's at the European level that the consequences could be very serious. So, but it's not. I mean, I won't be fighting for your own sake. Back in Paris in the National Assembly, I'm one of the last ones to say, no, but Britain has to stay in Europe. You know, keep working with them. They're like, no, it's over. We'll look at other countries. We'll look at Germany, at northern countries, at eastern countries, at Asia and Brazil. But
all depends what you mean by in Europe. I
don't
imagine for a second we're not going to have a very strong relationship with all our European partners, whatever we do with the treaties.
And on that note, we'll say goodbye to you. Thank you for coming on to the programme, and thank you for being our guest of the day, Axelle Lemaire.
Thank you.